Today we have on Samuele Marcora, researcher, physiologist, probably best known for the psychobiological model, and something we talked about extensively on part 1. This is going to be part 2. Part 1, go back and listen to that. I'll link to it down below for people watching and listening. So there were some things that we didn't have time to get to in that conversation. We wanted to revisit it here. So definitely part 1 will be a good introduction to this conversation and good background stuff. So go listen to that if you haven't already. We are also joined by Michael FitzGerald of Optimal Performance Training, and he's going to help co-host because he is someone who's read a lot more of the research than me. The Fitness Movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. We offer coaching and individualized program design, as well as educational content for coaches and athletes. It's all one place, zorfitness.com.
We did a time to exhaustion test, so run for as long as you can on the Bonneville salt flats. Yeah, it was great.
I saw that video.
You saw it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was really
Is that where people don't know how long they're running for?
Totally zero. I mean, some people thought that they ran for an hour, 90 minutes, and they ran for 4.
Oh my gosh.
But you lose
I'd probably be the opposite. I've been like, hey, I'm going for 4 hours. They're like, actually, that's been 45 minutes, man.
Yeah, because of the CrossFit. The one that did that, she was, world champion, 5,000, 10,000, silver medal at the Olympics, and I think her best time on the marathon was, she's old now, she's 55, 2:27 on the marathon. So
Wow.
I guess depends on your perspective. But I think she never ran if you ran 2:27 in a marathon, you never ran in your life 4 hours, basically. She never ran for 4 hours because...
Didn't need to.
You don't need to. They go so fast. So, it was fun. Mm-hmm. There was very high-end production, actually. Really, So I know the magic of editing.
Yeah, a few things we wanted to talk about. The first one I had bookmarked that we wanted to revisit was mental fatigue and psychological strategies to improve performance. So, I'll let you. Is there anything more specifically you wanted to mention within that, Sam?
Since that's maybe general. At the end, it's part of the strategy. So there's a brain endurance training, which is or brain stimulation. These are more experimental, but it's nice maybe for people to know about these new things. But it all starts with mental fatigue anyway. So
I think because Ben and I'm not sure if you know, but so Sam was, I think you wrote a really good chapter in a really good book from Carla Mayan. Is that how you pronounce her last name? Yeah. It was mostly, there was a lot of, probably the latter half of the book was a lot about strategies for managing.
What's the book name?
I can't remember the book name now, actually.
Well, let's find out. Yeah, it's a sports psychology book, but there are also some quite practical takes into it.
Yeah.
I think it's called The Psychology of Endurance Performance.
Something like that.
I'll dig it out.
I think if you have the author and you just put in psychology of endurance, it'll come up. It's a small book, but it's a good book, and there's lots of different things in there. But I guess because I know once Sam starts talking about it, they've done a lot of work and a lot of research in this and from different fields. But I think just if people listen to the first podcast, they are kind of following along. But I guess a similar thing I would like to start with is how, in your perspective, Sam, how did it? Where did research start, or where did thinking start that, hey, if this is a really important aspect of fatigue, I guess where did that start? Are you going to start? You just start back with Mosso, and stuff, and then where did it, in contemporary research, where do they go? I think we really have to focus on how to manage this, because this is a gigantic portion of endurance performance, as opposed to how do we possibly improve mitochondrial density? How do we get more capillarization? Instead of that worldview, right? So that's a large question, but I think people who are not familiar with the topic would really benefit from some type of literal, a quick summary or literature review from how you see it.
Yeah.
Real quick, the book was called Endurance, Performance, and Sport.
Yeah. Psychological Theory and Intervention.
And the author, what's her name? Carla Mayung?
Mayhen, Meijen, I think.
Yep, you got it.
She's Dutch.
Yep.
She's Dutch. Very good sports psychologist. So yeah, that's quite interesting, your question, because most people would think, being Italian as well, that the inspiration for the study that we did and published in 2009 comes from Mosso, Professor Mosso, who is a very famous Italian physiologist, who wrote a book called La Fatica. I guess even the Americans can understand it's a fatigue. But it was published, and I have the second edition, in 1891. Great stuff. Also, it was the Industrial Revolution, so they were very concerned about the physiological, but in those days they were more Renaissance men, also the sociological and psychological consequences of fatigue, especially in the workplace. But funny enough, it's often mentioned in history of exercise physiology, also because it was the first one to actually measure, to build an ergometer, so a device to measure work. We know the ergometers, right? In CrossFit, you can measure power, work and time, and that's how you measure power. It was the first one to actually measure one. But which muscle was testing? It's really funny. So the muscle is the middle finger. So it was lifting the weight with the middle finger, measuring, he knew the load, he measured the distance, and then there was like a revolving kind of drum where he was writing with a little pen. So he could measure displacement, force, time, and repetitions. So he was the first ergometer ever. He built a lot of things. He even did the first measurement of brain activity. So he was measuring in people that skull fractures, the blood flow, the increasing blood flow when they were thinking. So anyway, so he always mentioned in this historical sense. But actually, I didn't really know much about the mental fatigue work. The reason, what sparked the idea to do the study, which, by the way, it was the very first experimental study testing the effects of mental fatigue on physical performers, published in 2009. But the idea came to me when, during my first sabbatical, which I decided, because I recognized during my clinical work about the importance of perceived fatigue. So I decided to spend my sabbatical in the School of Psychology at Bangor University, where I was. Very good, actually. Also very good cognitive neuroscience, just to learn the way the psychologists and cognitive neuroscience, they think and work. And one of the way which I found very useful to learn was to be a guinea pig of all the experiments they were doing. So I was doing this working memory experiments where I had to do this working memory task, and at the same time they were zapping my brain while I was doing it. And even if doing psychological experiments, they want to reduce as much as possible mental fatigue, so they give you breaks and stuff like that. But despite that, at the end, I remember, I'm not very good at working memory, at the end of the session, was about an hour and a half, I was totally knackered, really tired mentally. And I thought, that's very interesting. I can use a prolonged cognitive task to change the state of my brain, basically, in a non-invasive way, tiring my brain without tiring the rest of the body, and see what's the effect of isolated fatigue of the brain on physical performance. So that's how I actually, and then I discovered that the only person that did, to be honest, was not really an experiment. He just tested a couple of professors with the middle finger ergometer. I don't know how Concept 2 would name this kind of ergometer. That would be fun. But anyway, so he measured that in only 2 people in 2 days. One day after they did the normal work, and another day when they lectured all day, all morning. And he found in only 2 people that when he measured them in this mental fatigue state, the performance was reduced. But that was in 1891, a couple of people in the book, that's it. And nobody is really strange because if you ask coaches, coaches are very aware of this mental fatigue problem. But scientifically, nobody really, before 2009, before I actually did the study, everybody focused only on muscle fatigue. So we know a lot about that. But after that, fortunately, there has been a lot of research after that. Actually, I found a preprint, just preparing for this podcast. There is even a study where they did look at the effects of fatigue on NG workout, but a reduced version instead of 100 reps per movement.
Angie. Yes, Angie.
Angie, yes.
Oh, okay.
50 reps each, not 100 reps each. And it seems that there is, but it's a preprint. So anyway, so it seems that it's been confirmed also in this kind of workout that there is a negative effect. So I can talk about the study. The study basically I induced mental fatigue by having these people doing this mentally demanding cognitive task on the computer for 90 minutes. And then I did, which I think is actually very relevant for CrossFit, on high intensity and cycling test that lasted on average 12 minutes. So, kind of a duration of a
Sam, was that one the time to exhaustion test, or was that the one where you were estimating critical power?
No,
effects on okay.
Yeah, that was something. That was time to exhaust. That was the first one in 2000. Was a time to exhaust, but high intensity. So I mean, they reached VO2 max at the end. Lactate was, I think, 12, 13 millimoles at the end. So high intensity stuff on purpose, because I wanted to use something that normally we think is only limited by oxygen delivery, lactic acid accumulation, all this kind of
more peripheral, right?
Exactly. So if I did like an hour-long test, people would have said, okay, second, no, I want on purpose. When you do experiments that are likely to prove you wrong rather than the other way around. So anyway, so I did it for that, and it's relevant to cost because it's kind of the duration is similar. And there was a very significant reduction in performance. By the way, the year before, I did a study looking at the effects of muscle fatigue on the very same test, and the subjects were very similar. Actually, few of them were the same subjects, and I did 100 drop jumps before the cycling test to exhaustion. So I really induced significant muscle fatigue in the legs. And if you compare the two studies, the effects of endurance performance is exactly the same. So doing this hard mental work for 90 minutes before the cycling test has the same negative effect of pre-fatiguing the leg muscles by doing 100 drop jumps. So that was quite interesting. But since then, there's been mostly replication. So if you look at the meta-analysis, they confirm that there is a significant effect on endurance performance. And
which honestly, in today's climate, that's a really important thing, the replication aspect, and having the meta-analyses displaying that, yes, this is a real thing, this really happens, and multiple different researching groups have shown this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, of course. But also, in a way, another constant finding is that like pure test of maximal strength or performance, like a leg extension or a jump,
really
single jump, that's not effective. I think for CrossFit is also relevant a body of research that actually we just submit a meta-analysis of that because now there are few studies. So people look at the effects of mental fatigue on performance doing kind of resistance training kind of workouts. And for example, we found that which fits with what we discussed last time, that, for example, the number of reps at 90% of 1RM is not affected. But if you look at the number of reps at 50 and 75% 1RM, it's reduced in a mentally fatigued state. So if you put together the research on endurance performance, including high intensity endurance performance with the durations that we see in CrossFit, and the research on number of reps during resistance training, I think I'm quite confident that, of course, it would be nice to have more studies looking at CrossFit workouts specifically, but I would be pretty confident that I would suspect that mental fatigue would negatively affect also a CrossFitter in terms of performance. Of course, we are talking about acute fatigue here. So we induce fatigue in an acute way. What I would like just to, then if you have time and if you want, we can go a little bit deeper. But what people call overtraining or non-functional overreaching, so these more prolonged states of fatigue that can really screw up your performance big time. To me, we call it overtraining because people think it's related to training, but I think it's actually a chronic form of mental fatigue. Actually, if you look at the symptoms, because people have physiologically, they are fatty, but they underperform, and they have all the symptoms that you have acutely with mental fatigue. So like a more negative mood, the perception of effort is increased, and of course the performance is reduced. So I think that mental fatigue in a chronic way is also very important in sport. So that's in a nutshell, I guess, where we come from. So of course, what can you derive from that is that if you want to perform optimally, you need to kind of taper, be wary, not only about arriving to the competition with muscles that are not fatigued. Also, your brain shouldn't be fatigued when you arrive at the competition, because that would reduce your performance. However, a lot of people, because of the way we do the experiments, people think, oh, I should only control and make sure that I don't fatigue myself mentally before the competition, which is important. But what people don't realize is that sport is chronically demanding. So the competition in sport can also induce mental fatigue. So, because when we do sport, we see the physical and we don't see so much the cognitive side of things, or emotional. It's not just the cognitive, the emotional, the motivational. So, for example, one of the cognitive functions that fatigue you the most is called response inhibition or inhibitory control. So every time that you do something painful and really uncomfortable, like CrossFit workout, and you force yourself to keep going, that's it's called executive. That's a mental thing that tires you a lot. So especially if you do a competition, when you do multiple workouts over several days, the CrossFit workout itself can induce mental fatigue over time. It's not just what you do before the competition, which is important. It's also how you manage the cognitive load, the mental load during the competition. And I think if you can manage that well, you can reduce it. Then you perform better than if you didn't pay attention to that kind of things. So
yeah, if anyone,
that's the first strategy, first application.
Yeah, and anyone that coaches people, which, Ben, you'll know this too, right? Individuals that go into a competition, it's imperative that, like what Sam's saying, like in practical terms, you try to minimize as many things as possible for them in terms of external stressors that aren't physical, because you're trying to control the variable of having the physical body be able to perform optimally, right, for 2-3 day competition, while also reducing and removing as much external noise as possible. But there's a couple things in there, right? What Sam's saying is that the response inhibition thing. So some people, like just with regards to a training session or with regards to competing, right? Like some people, may think that you don't want to lay down, you don't want to act out during a competition, you don't want to yell or scream, but that is a way of not having to like have a response inhibition. Like, oh, I'm not gonna grunt here. You're like, no, just do it. Like, let it out. Like, just do what you're gonna do. Like, because then you don't have to think about it. And so there's a lot into that in terms of coaching and how to set people up for that, and things you want to do to reduce the anxiety and stress of the individual that's going to go into the competition. Like lots to do with planning and like game planning, that type of stuff. But then the
logistics, even just logistics,
yes,
travel,
all those things, right? You want to get rid of
remembering the supplements to bring, even stupid things like that can
exactly.
Can
but the answer, like the truthfulness of the claim, is built into the actions, right? So people do this because they know it helps. They do all these things because they know it helps. They don't go to a competition disorganized. They don't intentionally stay like an hour and a half drive from the competition. They don't like have things not planned for eating during the day. They just don't do that because they know it'll make it worse, and they know they won't perform well, and nothing physically has happened. It's just their brain is getting more and more fatigued. And then the outcome after a competition, right? Like for most people, some people are different, but most people, the day after a long competition of 2 or 3 days, you can't ask them to do much. And they may not be that beat up, but mentally they are not going to be willing to exert effort. Because it's just a matter of fact in terms of like they're mentally fatigued. They're very tired mentally, and they don't want to experience that because there's so much emotion and anxiety throughout those several days. And again, anyone who's done a competition knows this, and anyone who's coached people through a competition knows this is true. And if you do, and like even if you've never heard Sam talk about this or anyone explain this, if you don't treat athletes in that way, then you're doing them a disservice. And the athletes would act, if they didn't know, they would ask a successful athlete, and they would go, "Why aren't you doing this? This is how you need to organize your schedule like this, your life like this for a competition. You have to."
Yeah, absolutely.
Like the more serious athletes, they tend to have a very similar schedule, like just when they're going throughout their weeks. Right. And then like anything that deviates them from that schedule is like super stressful. So like, you know, your kid is crying at 2 a.m. That's super stressful because it's gonna, you know, obviously like you care for the kid, but then also like for your own selfishness, it's like you care about your training, right? You care about your own schedule, and anything that's out of the norm from your normal week, if you have more appointments or more or less busy than you normally are, if you have to travel, like all that stuff, obviously competition would be a huge deviation from that. It's like all that stuff requires way more mental bandwidth, and also is just like stressful as a whole. And then it's like you take somebody who's like super routine like that and you put them into a setting where it's like this matters the most to you, and that is a competition. And then also like it's everything is like novel or new. It's like, of course, that would be incredibly stressful if you didn't like really put a lot of time into planning all of the logistics, like Sam was saying, to make sure it's like as smooth and as streamlined as you possibly can, so that you do like lower that mental tax that comes along with it.
Yeah, something that sometimes is difficult to control because the logistics kind of stuff, especially if you think about it. And I think probably one of the impact of my research is because people knew about these things, but showing really how impactful it is. And I think people now pay a little bit more attention to this aspect. But something that is difficult to, and you mentioned it before briefly, is emotion. A lot of people, especially doing portal competition, they have this pre-competition anxiety. And of course, I mean, if you can reduce it, there are psychological techniques to reduce the anxiety, that's great. But sometimes you can't, or you cannot do it to a great extent. In that situation, as a coach, if you can find safe ways, that maybe you don't want to, I don't know, tell your judge to bugger off. You want to do it in a safe and socially acceptable way. But if you can find a way to express your emotion instead of keeping it in, maybe because you don't want to show it to your competitor, find a place, find a way to be able to express your emotion, because inhibiting emotions is very mentally tiring. There is this study that really surprised me, experimental study, where they showed a documentary of a Japanese woman vomiting and then eating her own vomit. And just thinking about it, you feel a bit of disgust. Disgust is an emotion. If you watch it, it's even worse. And then they had 3 conditions. Okay, they have a condition where they didn't show the video. And then they have another condition, I call it the English stiff upper lip condition, where you see the video, but you were instructed not to show your emotions. So that's the English condition. And then there is the Italian condition. So you see the video and you're free to express your emotion as much as you like. Huh? Well, the watching the video and controlling your emotions had a negative effect on a subsequent, was I think 15 minutes time trial on the bike, compared to expressing your emotion of this, in that case of disgust. I mean, okay, so looking at somebody eating on vomit is not great, but emotionally, for sure, the stress that many athletes experience in the competition, emotion is much higher. So I think trying to find a safe way to express your emotion can also be a good tip for coaches and athletes.
I think, like obviously, you're like the shorter time durations, 10 to 15 minutes, is more relevant to a CrossFit audience. But I think for people to understand as to kind of what you mentioned earlier with 90 to 100% 1RM and the effects of mental fatigue on that type of stuff, that obviously it is going to be more of a spectrum from you're talking 100% RM down to 10% RM on a cycle ergometer for 90 minutes. But I'm going to assume that likely, right, the more you extend that time out, the more likely you're going to see the effects of mental fatigue on actual performance, right? So if you have a multi-day event, like literally like a multi-day running event where you have to cover like 200 miles, you're probably likely to see the effects of that much more obvious than a 2K row. Because you're going to get...
Even it's interesting because actually I think they did 2 or 3 studies on row. Even on the 2K row, you see it.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that the more you extend out the duration of the effort, the more likely it's probably to have even a larger effect.
Yes, and that's why in my original study I chose like a shortish study. But it's interesting. Even in, for example, 75% 1RM in our study, we found a reduction. But you're right. The longer the duration, the bigger the effect. But something that I think is a big relevant to CrossFit is that more technical. So we did studies. There's a big thing in soccer, in football.
Good skill.
Our football. The technical decision making, even some study also tactical as a group, seems to deteriorate. So the more again, cognitive control you have on a movement, the more it's going to be affected by mental fatigue. So another way to be less affected by mental fatigue in something that is technical, of course, is to have a very good the more automate. It's never going to be 100% automatic. No. It's very interesting. Even walking, which you will think, gosh, I don't have to think about walking. It's in humans. I mean, cats, you can get the cortex out and they bloody run anyway. But in humans, we have very high cortical control, or even things like simple locomotion, like walking. And that's where for example, when you add the cognitive load, you see differences in the way people walk. They slow down or they change their gait. So imagine in a more complicated movement. But the least automatic is your technique, the more it's going to be affected by something like mental fatigue. So even if things like, one RM leg extension doesn't seem to be affected by mental fatigue, I don't know, a snatch, repeated cycling, maybe even if it's kind of short, it may be affected because just the technique is wrong. So, but we don't have studies on complex very short movement. But I wouldn't, based on this thing about the technique we just discussed, I wouldn't exclude the potential that in highly skilled, even very short movement, but highly skilled, you may have a deterioration due to mental fatigue.
I think most people could relate to that who are listening to this, where it's like if you have a movement that you can do when you're having a good day, but then if you slept 6 hours instead of 8, it feels much more labored, or like the coordination is lacking. And that might be slightly different than mental fatigue, but I think they probably intertwine a bit. Like, you're doing double unders on a full night's rest versus shorted. It definitely goes differently.
The one interesting tidbit there, Sam, is that which is quite obvious, and Ben, you'll know this too. You'll probably experience this. I've experienced this. So if you think of like a weightlifting competition at the Olympics, right? Like they perform 6 lifts and it takes them however many time to do it. And, between lifts, they're preparing and lifting and doing whatever they have to do to get warm. But in CrossFit, right, for the best CrossFit individuals or the best performers in CrossFit, many times they will hit a new personal best after like doing a 15-minute time trial. Right, they will do a 15-minute row time trial or something, and then in the next 7 minutes they have to establish a 1 rep max clean and jerk, and very often you'll see a new personal best. Actually, and which I would say it's probably more likely to see that on the snatch, or if it was just a jerk, because they're more technical movements and requiring less time under tension, which is a bit of an odd. It's a bit of a counterintuitive thing, but I think in those scenarios I remember reading it from a study suggesting it's almost like when endurance athletes, which CrossFit people are, like they just get more and more warmed up when they do something like that. They actually become more ready to actually train. Whereas if you took a weightlifter right to the Olympics and did that, they would perform horrifically, because like their physiology is just not ready for that. So it's just such an interesting thing where like, before you do the 15-minute time trial in the row, like the 15-minute time trial could easily be affected because you were being stupid and you were not planning your day out and you're showing up late to the event. But you still may end up hitting a 1 rep max snatch, to your point that, a really heavy lift may not be affected by mental fatigue, but the idea of the endurance aspect potentiating the lifting, even though there will be mental fatigue incurred from the rowing activity. It's just there's a lot going on there, which is where it gets complicated. But I just wanted to bring up that observation because that's a very common thing.
Yeah. But you see, obviously, performance depends on many things. So, for example, I can think about, contrary to maximal strength, maximal power is highly affected by muscle temperature. Because the velocity of the contraction, the maximal force, not so much, but the velocity, so maybe, you really need to have warm muscles. But I would say, obviously, the competitive environment is probably what giving these people the extra burst. And so, because sometimes you can have an improvement when you have something that is very positive, something that is negative, and the net effect is positive. You know what I mean? That's why we do experiments, right? To try to isolate. But of course, in real life, there are so many things going on, and you may be, do your best performance when you're mentally fatigued because something else. You're on a good day, and you're gonna perform even better. It's a complicated mix of factors. But but I just wanna. It'd be nice to do some studies, for example, on CrossFit with complex movements to see what would be the effect of this. Also, in terms, that's more for the chronic, I guess. But it's quite interesting that there is actually a study in Division One American football players where they look at injuries. That they found that when they compared, the places where they did a lot of training, they come back, to do training stuff that a bit more overuse injury that's due to the physical stress, physical load. But they also found that the injuries increased during exam periods compared to the periods where academically were not so stressed. So that, it's not experimental, but, it suggests that training or competing in a state of especially kind of chronic mental fatigue can actually increase the risk of injury as well. So you need to pay attention as much as you do for muscle fatigue, I would say.
Yeah, on that,
for sure.
Almost like a very similar study to looking at specifically university students going through exam periods for that same outcome we were saying for injury, right? I believe a couple of studies I read in a paper from John Keeley, if you know that name. I think he's at. Where is he?
Yeah.
I think it might be at Exeter. I can't remember. Anyway, he was writing a paper basically talking about adaptation to training in general, like adapting to training stress, and talking about like how do athletes actually adapt, and just using an example of if you're chronically mentally fatigued or you're emotionally struggling, you like if you remove that, you'll adapt to the training better too, like just neurologically and physiologically, because there's a chemical endocrine response to it, is that you'll be better able to actually handle the stress and adapt to the stress. And he's like, here's examples. Like, you take these people or this group of people going and have them go through this short-term study or short-term training program during this phase, and just look at the differences in adaptation response from you do it at 6 months later when they're just in regular like academic studies. They're not in a period of like 2 or 3 weeks of testing. He's like, that's the real main difference. And he goes, yeah, obviously these are all low-trained people, so it's kind of hard to interpret. He goes, but the real main difference is that it's outside of a period of known high stress. So, the mental fatigue aspect it affects a lot of things.
Good.
Yeah.
Also, it is. I think a lot of people in sport now, rightly so, they pay a lot of attention to sleep hygiene for recovery, etc. Fine, but it's interesting that poor sleep has a negative effect on performance. Actually, it's kind of similar to mental fatigue. It seems to affect primarily endurance, cognitive function, etc. And you have an independent effect of poor sleep on performance. But there are some studies, especially in the military, actually, a NATO group. I work with a lot of American.
And I wanted to ask you about the sleep deprivation stuff. So
yeah, the lack of sleep, so poor sleep, interacts with mental fatigue. So when you are in a sleep deprived or sleep restricted state, and you engage in a mentally demanding task, you develop more mental fatigue. So because we define mental fatigue as the psychological state induced by doing a demanding cognitive task. The fatigue induced by poor sleep, it's a different kind of fatigue, but they interact. They're separate effects, but the worst thing is that they interact. So if you have poor sleep and you do something psychologically demanding, you're gonna get even more mentally fatigued. So it's a double whammy kind of thing. There is a double whammy and the interaction between them. So it's really, sleep hygiene is important also to reduce mental fatigue when you actually do something, during competition, during training. So I think it's very important to pay attention to sleep hygiene. And on the other hand, what works for reducing the negative, if you get to a point where you are sleep deprived and mentally fatigued, at least in the short term, you can do quite a lot to reduce the negative effects with a proper use of caffeine. And the reason seems to be that both mental fatigue and sleep deprivation, at least in part, they seem to depend on the accumulation of the metabolite, which is adenosine. So the neurons basically, like the muscle, they use ATP for their function, but they degrade ATP down to adenosine, and they export it, accumulates in the brain, and when it accumulates, it really reduces the excitability of neurons. And what caffeine does, it basically blocks the adenosine receptor. So the adenosine cannot have a negative effect on the neurons. That's why caffeine is actually a stimulant. Is something that blocks a depressant. And the effect is stimulation, but and that's why it works particularly well when you're tired, when you haven't slept, you really feel the effect even more so than normal because it blocks this adenosine. So caffeine, is done in an intelligent way, it can be a good, at least a short-term fix for both the negative effects of sleep deprivation and mental fatigue. We don't know the problem that in terms of caffeine, we don't know, there's not so much research on how to best use it in the context when you do a lot of repeated bouts of exercise or multi-day performance. So we know how it works for a one-off, but how to optimize the intake over a long day or even multiple days of performance is something that we need to get better information. But it definitely works, so it's worth. I don't know. Actually, in CrossFit, I don't really. Do people use caffeine? How
I don't know
common
if
it is?
I don't know if they use caffeine pills, but they would use drinks or
Uh,
gels and coffee. Obviously,
yeah.
coffee's not that much. The one thing I would
Well,
be
it depends.
like,
Depends what kind of coffee. The
mhm,
problem with coffee, the jazz normally don't have much. The problem with the drinks and the coffee and stuff that sometimes the quantity is not well controlled. So the pills, you get better control exactly how much you're
yeah,
taking.
I've
Um,
used those during races, caffeine pills, along with acetaminophen for some races. But so like one of the things, like so two things there. One, which are kind of related, is that you would definitely need to practice and figure that out because, like what you're saying,
Absolutely.
Sam, over the course of multiple days, if you for example, what if you inadvertently try too hard on day one because you're getting like the wrong feedback because you're like, oh, I'm not trying as hard, or it actually doesn't hurt quite as much. When you wake up the next day and you go, actually, I went really hard and I'm really, really hard. And now because the reality is that your body doesn't care if you took acetaminophen. Like your quadriceps are going to be more fatigued, right? And they'll be less responsive to activation because you overdid it. And I remember for me when I was practicing for my marathon, and I was like, okay, I got to try this stuff out. Like practicing, trying to get the dosage for the caffeine right and the acetaminophen. But I remember one time I did it, like my pacing was so erratic versus I could normally just stay right at my marathon pace and go. Whereas I had to constantly look down at my watch and I was like, oh, I'm going too fast. I was constantly going too fast because I couldn't feel it. I was like too excitable. And so when I actually did the race, I was like, I'm going to wait until 1 hour in to do this because I have to get my early pacing right. And I don't
Yeah,
want to feel like I'm digging myself a hole here.
yeah, yeah. I totally
Yep.
agree. I think, especially in the context of a long day or multiple days, I think waiting to use it when either later on when you think you're gonna get fatigue or when you get fatigue. There are also gums that were developed in the States for the so there are chewing gums and they are absorbed in the mucosa. So in 10 to 15 minutes they are absorbed, contrary to the drinks that take at least half an hour, better an hour to. So that can also be good. But it's funny that a lot of people screw up their pacing in the marathon, but I guess also in cross the competition.
More so
Um,
in CrossFit because it's
yeah,
novel every
big,
time.
yeah, also because of that. So yeah, less experience in, but also because the competitive environment makes you feel less perception of effort. And therefore, if you don't pay attention to some other external cues like the watch or the timing, something else that is objective, if you pace yourself purely based on how you feel, because the competitive, the verbal encouragement, the social, we have all these experiments that prove what we know that you actually feel better. That's why you go faster. But then, of course, that's a perceptual effect. Then, as you said, the muscle is the same. So you're going to pay later on with excessive muscle fatigue, the fact that you started too quick. So yeah, I think that's to wait until you're fatigued or when you think you're gonna get most of fatigue, I think is a good. But we need more research. But I
Yeah,
think as a
Yeah, and I think really experienced athletes are just athletes who maybe they just do it more naturally well. They understand that if I have a more endurance based event, that I can't trust how I feel on competition day in like a positive sense. Like I need to actively hold myself back and be disciplined to hold the paces that I plan to hit rather than just going off of what I feel great. So, I'm just going to go for it. Which I think some people who are newer to competing get caught up in that a little bit more. And then, like, I've personally coached athletes on this, like, for example, say it's like a 10K run or something in a CrossFit type event. It's like they very rarely run 10K if ever in their training. So it's like you might give them like, hey, like the first 6K, like hold to this pace regardless of how you feel almost. And then it's like after that, you're, 60+% of the way into the event, you should know how you're going to feel and you can start to deviate from that point. But like the first part, like, and you might even do the same thing in like a 5-round workout. Like, hey, first 3 rounds, don't change your plan. Like stick to it regardless of how you feel, because we've done it in training. We know how it should feel. And then for some reason, if you still feel really good in round 4 and 5, you're like, okay, go for it. I think, again, at least experienced athletes or athletes who do it well, they understand that pretty intuitively.
Yeah. Although I think something interesting about CrossFit is that it's easy to pace yourself doing, how you call it, monostructural or the aerobic cardio kind of stuff. For certain, you cannot really change your pace so much in other movement, right? It's not like, with running, you can go as low as you want up to very fast.
It just turns into managing work rest.
Yeah, exactly. It's more that, right? And then rather the actual speed of the movement. But I think, yes, I mean, pacing is, actually, there was a podcast and there was Jason Khalifa. They actually, I did put a comment, they show it up, and he said that he thinks that one of the biggest changes in course has been people paying more attention to pacing compared to the old days. And I think Michael and his brother had a bit of a effect on this, to warn people about
and Sam, for like any of people that are from, like maybe they're listening to this podcast because they're fans of you exclusively, right? And maybe they don't know what CrossFit is, but I always try to explain it to people that, like, think of like if for someone who knows, like, they know what their critical power is on a cycle ergometer, and I was like, okay, let's just pick it. Let's just say it's 300 watts, okay? Now imagine you have to, like the way CrossFit works, imagine you have to do a 5K time trial, but it has to be at 500 watts. You have to 500 watts. That's the only time the reps count is 500 watts. And when you drop below, you don't get to slow down, you have to stop. And then you got to wait till you can go back up to 500 watts. Now pace it. How are you going to pace that, right? So, because that's functionally what's happening inside of the body when you're engaging in these movements, right? It's not rowing and cycling where you can speed up and slow down easily, because those movements have a really nice, like a really large range of intensities, right? You go from like cycling down to 0 watts up to 2,000. Wall balls are somewhere, they're fixed, right? The wattage is fixed for the most part. You can slow the movement down a little bit, speed it up. And like burpees have more of a range, and there's like, you can load the bar, and I was like, just to give you guys an example, because a lot of athletes don't get this, I was like, I could give you a 4-pound wall ball and it's not sustainable. You can't keep doing this. Like, your muscles will end up experiencing what would be considered severe intensity activity. That's what you're going to see if you actually measure this with, like the easiest one would be like a NIRS device, but you don't even need that. You just ask people, like, what's happening to your shoulders? You're like, it's getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. I'm like, yeah, that's not how sustainable activity goes. Like, that's not how it goes. So just in terms of people listening, like, think of it, imagine how you would pace a 5K bike if you could only go at 500 watts.
That's a good one. That's a good one. By the way, I worked with some people when I was in the profession. They could go at 420 watts for 40 minutes on a bike.
Well, he'd do pretty good then. He could do 5K probably at 500.
That was 20 years ago, so I don't know what they can do.
Yeah.
So anyway, yes. So I think the other thing that I guess we need to touch upon is the what we're discussing with the book, right? So what we found is that not only in skill sports and focus and attention, this kind of things, but also endurance sports can really benefit from athletes for learning psychological skills. So we did several experimental studies showing that, but I primarily concentrated on motivational self-talk, but I also had the strategies discussed. Indeed, I'm not a sports psychologist, so I'm not going to go into details about this. Maybe you can ask Carlos, some good sports psychology, at plenty in the States as well, to discuss this. But learning psychological skills can really, have a really important effect on performance, even on something that is not, shooting or super cognitive. Even something like endurance can really benefit. And so I think it's something that I don't know how much CrossFit use sports psychologists. And it's not, because a lot of people think that sometimes sports psychology is a kind of clinical stuff. No. Okay, you may need a sports psychology also for anxiety and this kind of stuff. Fine. But what I'm talking about is really learning how to use things like switching your focus of attention, try to reduce negative self-talk and replace it with more positive motivational thoughts rather than negative ones. Things like having different goals during the competition instead of focusing maybe on a more distant goal. Things that, really kind of relatively simple stuff, but that people sometimes I think overlook, and they seem to have really beneficial effects on endurance performance. Even in elite level athletes, for example, where you're involved in marathons. I was at the very first attempt in Monza in Italy to go below 2 hours with Kipchoge, and then he did it 2 years later in Vienna, and it was older. I think that probably physiological was a bit worse than in Monza, but he actually did it. And I think that he said that one of the main reasons why he did it the second time is because in Monza, it's a Formula One, it's a very fast track, and there were only about 200 people. It was by invitation, so there were only few, 200 people over the straight. The rest of the very long track, they were by themselves. And even an athlete like that, somebody that can run a marathon below 2 hours, he suffered the fact that he didn't have people cheering for him. That's why the second time he did it in the park, and there were people all over the course. So even at a very high level, something as simple as having a cheering crowd, he said he made maybe not all the difference, but it certainly made the difference to the performance. So do not underestimate the power of these skills that can be learned relatively quickly. For example, in the motivational self-talk study, they had, I think, an hour meeting with the sports psychologist. Then they practiced the skill for a couple of weeks, and then they applied it to the test, and they had a significant improvement in endurance performance. So very simple. But by the way, like anything else, never try something new in competition. Practice it to find out also, especially with psychological stuff, you need to individualize the approach, but also because of what we were discussing earlier about mental fatigue. You need to practice these skills so that they become as automatic as possible. Because if you have to think about it during the competition, that's going to have a very negative effect because it's going to mentally fatigue you. And also, you're going to have this called cognitive motor interference, that cognitive load can interfere with the movement control. So you need really to practice this so that they become quite automatic and not demanding mentally. For example, a very good strategy, especially in costly competitions, many things can go wrong actually. You need to be like ultra endurance, is to think about in advance all the possible things that can go wrong, and then you have, it's called if then. So if something happens, then I do this. So that the decision to do what to do if something happens is almost, it's automatic. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to spend your mental resources in that. And I think, and a lot of things. For example, you can predict maybe certain movements, certain workouts. And I know it's difficult, but be maybe prepared. Okay, if this kind of movement comes in, this is going to be my strategy. If these are, and I think I'm sure you already do it in coaching now for CrossFit. Try to prepare for the eventualities. But this thing also that's a good strategy. So control mental fatigue as much as possible. Try to reduce it. A good use of caffeine, learning psychological skills. I think these are already proven ways to improve your performance. Then there are two other things that are a bit more experimental. One is brain stimulation. There were actually an American company a while ago, I think now it went under. They were selling this kind of electrical brain stimulation thing, and it didn't really work very well for them. But to do the brain stimulation that we do in experimental studies, it's not the same thing that you can do with this commercial, and it depends a lot on where you stimulate the brain. But there is, evidence that you can change the excitability of your cortex of your brain, and this may improve performance, at least for about the effect probably is no longer than an hour. But for example, for CrossFit workout, so for example, in a marathon, I don't think it would be very beneficial. But for things like CrossFit, it may be. The other one, which I think is more applicable, is this what we call brain endurance training. So what fatigues you acutely can also be, inducing fatigue is the first part of the super compensation. There's things wrong with that, but it's a good heuristic, no? So first you do a workout, you get fatigue, then you recover, and then you get hopefully a positive adaptation. So that was my idea. So if doing this cognitive task mentally fatigue me, there may also be a training stimulus. So I may become more resistant to mental fatigue by exposing myself to this mentally fatiguing task, especially if I combine them with exercise, because we actually did a study, we haven't published. If you do them kind of separately, they don't work as well. It works if you do sort of mental fatigue associated with training, possibly because physical training is a very good stimulus for neuroplasticity. So it probably is you need to combine. So, and we have done a few studies also, the University of Birmingham, they've done a few studies. There's nothing specific on CrossFit, but cyclists, soccer players, there is something that's a bit of a secret. So that if you combine mental fatigue with training, it can be a new training method, if you like. Right? Because, for example, a lot of people, if they're mentally fatigued, because the quality of the workout in terms of output is reduced. So they may think, no, listen, I'm not going to train, I'm going to do some accessory, something easy, because I'm mentally fatigued, and that's not going to be productive. That's true, of course, if the stimulus that you want to have is cardiorespiratory or muscular. But think about the opportunity that maybe when you're mentally fatigued, just for work, for other reasons, you know what I mean, just life happens. Don't think that it's a wasted session, okay? You could use that, okay, this is an opportunity to train myself to resist to mental fatigue and in a way that is specific to my sport, for example. So to do workouts in a mentally fatigued state, either induced artificially or just by your life, we often are mentally fatigued. I think it can be a good strategy. Don't think it's a wasted time. Another way to do it is during interval training. You do your intervals, where of course there are intensity and stuff, so you're engaged in a mental way. And then in the recovery period, instead of doing nothing, you do like you can do a cognitive task on a computer or something, so that your body recovers and then you do the next interval, but your brain stays continually engaged during the training session. That's something that seems to be like a practical way to add the cognitive load to the training session. So I would say this is some practical things that people can do to. Another one, for example, you have a workout, and while you're doing the workout, you have maybe something that words or something that you have try to remember. So you keep in your brain some information while you're doing the workout, and then at the end of the bout or the workout, you have to write down all the things that you remember. So that you add, it's called working memory. So while you're doing the workout, you also have to do something mentally demanding. That can also be a way to add cognitive load to a workout. I think this could also be a good way to, for example, add cognitive, total load to an athlete when they cannot maybe train very much because of injury. So that maybe they cannot push hard physically, and also has a psychological consequences, because you think, oh gosh, my competitor is training hard, I cannot. And that's also negative psychologically. In those situations, for example, you can say, okay, you cannot train physically so hard. Let's add some cognitive load to kind of maybe compensate for the reduced physical load. So I think also this is something that, okay, we need more research. So not everything I just said there's no study to prove, but there are now some studies showing that adding this cognitive load can improve performance compared to a training session where you do not add this cognitive load. So I think we call it brain endurance training. I think it's something new that may be worth considering in training.
Is there any resources or tools people could use? I know you said in research you're gonna maybe sit them in front of a computer or something.
Yeah.
Practically, is there something that could work well?
One good thing he mentioned, I think, was the easy one, and maybe you just give an example, Sam, would be holding words in your head during a set.
Yeah.
I think that'd be a really simple one. Can you just give me an example of what that would be? Let's just say they did a 2-minute interval, 2-minute rest, 10 sets. What are you asking them to hold on to?
Well, the way we do it, we have a list of words, but I don't know, it could be, some a podcast or something that you need to remember what they're talking about. Just something that you have to keep in the studies that we do. Is just a list of words.
And those are novel things, right? They're not they're these people aren't remembering their wife's name, their kids' names, because these are
no.
Yeah.
Just a list of words, and at the end of the, but even just for 5 minutes, nothing. And then at the end of the thing, they have to write down as many words as they remember.
I like that. That's
of course,
nice.
the more words they remember, the better their performance. So, but I mean, anything that kind of is mentally demanding, it can be used for this.
So it's interesting. You're getting that interaction effect too here with what you remember what you said with mental fatigue interacts with sleep deprivation to make everything worse. So in here you would get the idea of and I think it's really important if you're going to have people do this, you tell them why you're asking them to do it. So at the end of a long day, or specifically for me, if I teach a seminar, if I teach coaches about something for a 2-hour session, I know afterwards mentally I'm so tired, but I many times I intentionally do shorter hard runs afterwards because that's what I train for is running. But I do it intentionally because I'm this is actually a good scenario for me to train this. But I know what I'm doing because I have I'm privy to the knowledge of. I'm not looking at this as a bad thing. I'm looking at this as an opportunity to do it. But I obviously don't do it every day. So I think if you are going to do that, just to tell people we're doing it for this reason. You're going to feel tired. It's going to feel worse. But it potentially is going to help someone like you, where maybe you don't actually train that much.
Yeah, and it's all a matter of intention. That workout is not going to be the best to improve muscular endurance or cardiorespiratory fitness, but it's an opportunity to improve your resistance to mental fatigue, which you may be exposed during competition. So I think that's exactly, it's the intention. Don't skip it just because it's not going to be good for my VO2 max.
Just so we're clear about it. How would you link, again, if we just stay on the mental fatigue as a whole and how it affects performance negatively, what in your if we were to try to make it fit with the psychobiological model, what is the real connection there? Is it that it drives RPE up? Is that the main effect?
See. Okay. No. That's why it works primarily on endurance, because it increases your perception of effort.
That's what I thought.
And so far we cannot find, from the neck down, you don't really see any difference. It's like an overtrained athlete. I mean, they're fine physiologically, but they feel tired and their perception of effort is higher than normal. And so absolutely, why is perception of effort increased in a mentally fatigue condition? We don't know really, but there are two possible reasons. Why is that the way the brain processes the central motor command is changed. Because a lot of people think that we discussed last time, right? That we perceive the motor drive, but that's a sensory signal. And of course, the intensity of that is going to be the primary reason why you feel more or less effort during a workout. And that's also why if you have muscle fatigue, if you try to lift the same weight with fatigue muscle, it's gonna feel heavier and harder to do than when you have fresh muscle, simply because you have to compensate for the reduction
the brain's got to work
maximal
harder.
force by driving your. However, any perception depends not only on the intensity of the sensory signal, it also depends how the brain processes the signal. So for example, if I give you the same pain stimulus, if you're in a good mood, you're going to feel less pain for the same stimulus than if you're in a bad mood, okay? So, and I think so the brain processing could be one explanation. The other one is that at brain level, this distinction between motor and cognitive effort and cognitive motor and cognitive control is not that clear. There is a lot of overlap. Even the supplementary motor area, for example, it has a lot of cognitive functions. The anterior cingulate cortex, which we think about in terms of decision making, cardiovascular control, it has a lot of motor function, even direct corticospinal, not even through the primary motor cortex, even directly. I didn't know that. I didn't realize the direct connection from the anterior cingulate cortex to the motor neuron, especially of the upper body. So and these are areas that are particularly engaged, and they also get, let's say, fatigue. So they have the negative effects of being engaged for so long when you do these mentally fatiguing tasks. So at brain level, cognition, emotion, motivation, and motor control, there is a lot of overlap in the brain areas devoted to this function. So that's why there is the transfer. That's why the tying those areas with the cognitive task can also affect you doing movements. But I guess, yeah, that's the in terms of endurance performance, the perception of effort, the increase in perception of effort is definitely the main mechanism. Of course, you also have, in terms of motor control, injuries, probably also the cognitive effects of mental fatigue and interference with movement control is probably important.
Yeah, you mentioned I guess pain perception in different mood states.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure it's there was an old study I read. I think it was from the concept by Bandura with self-efficacy, and then measuring pain response to specific things in individuals or athletes with high self-efficacy as the ranking versus low self-efficacy. And they use that as like one metric that really moderated pain response and pain perception was like in terms of the task, and like so the competency and the confidence in their own ability to manage and withstand and cope, which like it's obviously a large category, but yeah,
very interesting. Yeah, it's how the brain processes the signal is massive. I mean, there are people that don't have any signal.
Yes.
I mean, there are people that, with amputees and stuff, that must be terrible. I can't even think about it. They have excruciating pain
and no limb
that they don't have.
Actually, Sam, one thing I wanted to ask you about, because I heard you mention this on a podcast, and this is not really related to what we're talking about here, but maybe it is. And it's obviously a sad topic, but you think about like how many of the best endurance individuals in the world have had trauma in their life.
Yeah.
I believe I heard you talk to someone about that, about having challenging
no,
childhoods or having like a really traumatic incident.
Yeah, it was Matt FitzGerald. I don't know if you're related, probably not.
I actually joke about that. I'm like, this is a great book by Matt FitzGerald, unrelated.
Yeah, he asked me specifically about that because I don't know, some of the, especially the early, legends of triathlon, they seem to have a lot of them to come from some painful. So I don't have an answer scientific, but I
yeah, no, I was looking for an anecdote just because I'm very interested in that.
It's something that I can see why having to cope, and especially if you're able to cope successfully with adversity, that may have like a training effect on your brain, so that other stressors, you may have the stress of having, I don't know, to deal with, abusive father or whatever. The thing is, again, a brain level, a physiological level, the way you respond to a variety of things that seem very different from
Yeah.
externally, the structures and I mean, if you think about the physiological response, you have a cortical response, you have an adrenergic response. I mean, to things like exercise, to things like emotional stress, to things like cold. So there are a lot of things that are very different, but the response is the same. It's called the cross stressor hypothesis, and therefore also the way you respond and maybe adapt. If you adapt successfully to this kind of stressor, may help you coping with other stressors in your life. But I'm not aware of research, especially research that tests the hypothesis on performance or pain tolerance or things like that. But I would say I think that would work in people that successfully cope with the adverse
Yeah, because it's not a guarantee.
situation.
It's not a guaranteed
No,
positive
no,
cope, right? Or
no,
that they're going to have a
no.
positive outcome, because a lot of times, right, it's very
Yeah.
much not so. But I just
And
remember you mentioning that, and I found that very interesting, because I've seen that
yeah,
many times.
yeah. And maybe
I
that's
forget where I heard
genetic
this.
or a training effect, we don't know. It may also be a genetic difference. People that are successful in coping with that kind of stress are also successful in coping with the stressors of a competition, who knows?
Forget where I heard this, but someone was, I think, interviewing someone who was like a elite ultra runner or something, and they were like, "What are you running from?" And I mean, as simple as it is, like, yeah, things like trauma or people got demons that they're dealing with. I think sometimes that motivates them to do things that otherwise people who have had not that in their lives don't feel the need to do. I also think that's the case for a lot of pain sports, like CrossFit. Like, there's a lot of people who come from, and that's is also part marketing on CrossFit's part, which they've done a good job with. But like, addicts who come in and then are able to basically successfully switch CrossFit with whatever they were going to before.
Yeah,
Interesting.
performance is extremely multivariate and it's why it's so interesting, right? As to how it works and what affects what and how it could all, and how can you make sense of it?
Yeah. And if you think about it, in a way, it's a bit of a kind of artificial stress that we create, but we had to do this kind of things. Maybe not courses, seems to be more endurance kind of activities, but to survive, right? And so we create these artificial challenges for ourselves. But I mean, that's good, because otherwise we eliminate any sort of stress. I mean, we all do. The body tends to also physically to avoid as much as possible, right?
Yeah.
The energy expenditure. So
I think a really good concept along with all of this, right? Which I think I'm not sure many in the audience would know, is Nicholas Nassim Taleb, his concept or what he propagated in terms of anti-fragility. The idea of, like, think of the top performers, like the example you were using, Sam, of talking about learning, like how you wouldn't want to introduce a new cognitive skill into a competition. You would want time to develop the ability, understand the ability, and get used to the ability. Because initially you add what seems like a new benefit to a low-trained, low-ability, not like fragile state, it's going to make it worse in a competition. Where if you give them time to get used to it and learn how to use it and get better, then they actually become better from it, right? And just like the best performers, you take a novice performer, you add a lot of stress to them, like you're learning to play guitar, put them in front of an audience, they're going to do even worse. But if you're the best guitarist in the world, it'll probably make you better. You'll probably play better because you're in front of an audience, because the anxiety probably heightens your ability to perform. But you have to be at that state to do that. And it's always so interesting.
Yeah. But also one thing, and maybe I guess maybe it could be a nice way to wrap it up, is we as coaches, because something that we can measure, we can modulate, we kind of worry a lot about the physical load or physiological stress that we induce. We need to consider this, some people call it psychological load of what we do, because actually the problem is that there is psychological load related to competition and to training, and can be used also, as a stimulus for improvement. But if it's excessive load without recovery, then we can get to the states of chronic fatigue, right? But the problem is that with physical load, okay, if you have a good coach, you reduce it or you completely stop it. With certain psychological stressors, because they call it, there are three categories. One is called performance, so training and competition. One is called organization. So it's the stress, psychological load, the stress related to the organization, or renewing the contract, if you're a professional athlete, a relationship with your coach, relationship with the teammates, stuff like that. And then there's a personal load. So the psychological stressors in your personal life, think about, I always think about soccer players here in Europe, they'll seem to have troubles with their fiancés, cheating with other people. So the problem that it cannot switch off. I mean, you can try coping skills, but try as a coach, try to see the load on your athlete and the recovery from it and the adaptation from it, not just from the physical perspective. Consider the overall load, therefore also the psychological load that your athlete has during competition, in your sport, but also outside of the box or the training center, in your personal life. And so especially when you see signs of chronic mental fatigue or even acute mental fatigue, don't think about, I should reduce maybe do a few more reps or reduce intensity. Also consider whether maybe the load is somewhere else, is a psychological, because I think managing that load as a coach, as an athlete, can give you really a competitive advantage compared to people that don't, especially if you're prone to develop these states of non-functional overreach and overtraining, which are basically chronic mental fatigue states, basically.
Yeah, or on the other side of it, right, which Ben, you did probably have experience with, right, is the individual or the athlete being unwilling to share that and saying that they are really challenged or they're really struggling at a certain time, and like mentally they're very exhausted or there's been a lot going on in their life. And like, for example, around our gym this week, that's a very prominent thing. It's important that they tell you that, because that's a very real thing. And if, like you're saying, right, if you ignore it and treat them as if they're like ready to peak for a competition, you could push them over the edge in terms of in terms of cognitive load and what you would do with them for the months to come, right? It's really important that they talk to you about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's really wise advice. We'll leave it there. So,
thank you, guys. It was a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure to speak with you, Sam.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. Too. Thanks for organizing it.
Ciao, ciao.
Thanks for listening today. If you're someone who just started listening to the show, I would encourage you to subscribe so you can stay up to date. If you're someone who's been listening for a while, I would encourage you to rate and review the show. And lastly, the best thing that you can do to support our work is also the best thing that you can do for your performance. And that is by hiring one of our coaches. Until next time, stay the course.